This is Alec.
And this is Jack.
Welcome to another episode of Smith and Scholar. Smith and Scholar is a multimedia project dedicated to promoting and encouraging young men to pursue and live the good life. Today's episode, we'll be talking about prudence. So last time we spoke, we kind of gave an overview of the four cardinal virtues and mentioning all of them, of course, but specifically prudence being the most important of the four. And that's why we're starting with it today. So you'll also notice if you're watching, we have upgraded.
Yeah, upgraded. One mic at least, we're working on it.
Yeah. Well, two new mic stands, a little makeshift pop filter for the moment. But what were you saying about that before, Jack? We're very lo-fi. We're very much lo-fi. Yeah. Yeah, that's what happens when you are your sound crew.
That is right.
Yeah. Okay, but we made this decision because we thought it'd be the best thing to do moving forward, and I'd say that might be a prudent decision, right?
I hope so.
Yeah, we'll see.
Hopefully it'll be followed by more prudent decisions.
All right, so Jack, you want to go ahead and get us started on what is prudence?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think first let's kind of give a roadmap for what we're going to be trying to do today. And first we're going to be starting off with defining prudence. And then we kind of want to talk about what prudence looks like, confusion about what prudence really is, maybe trying to distinguish what is prudence and what's not for some concrete examples. And then we'll try and tie it in why we think prudence is important, particularly as it pertains to all the virtues, sort of in the way which we talked about last time. But to start, we can start with a definition of prudence. And I think most broadly speaking, prudence is acting at the right place, at the right time, in the right way, in accordance with the right reason. So basically, to shorten that, it's the right application of right reason. And there are, I think, two important things that we can get from this definition. And to preface, I've taken this definition, and Alec and I have talked about this, and we find the work of Joseph Pieper, particularly in his book, The Four Cardinal Virtues, to be particularly enlightening, and we recommend that book to anyone who wants to read more. Pieper is a Thomist, so a philosopher who studies and tries to understand the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, so he takes a particularly Christian view of it, but we recommend it to anyone. But anyway, again, taking that definition, the right application of right reason, there are two things we probably can glean from that. One is right reason, and this is what Pieper called the universal principles of practical intellect, and we'll get into that a little deeper in a second. And then second, there's that right application, or the components of right place, right time, and in the right manner. And I think what this aspect indicates is that the exercise of virtue and its development, particularly prudence, doesn't happen abstractly or in a vacuum, and rather it requires concrete situations in which we can actualize it. It requires human action.
Yeah, so I think that part is important, that it's not just something in your mind, and we will get a little bit later on talking about how it can be taught or how you can experience prudence, because I think that gets a little bit more interesting of even though it is concrete decision-making, how do you learn prudence?
Right.
And I think that's also an issue with all the virtues, is how do you learn a virtue? I'll touch on it briefly. When you're born, you don't have virtue. I wouldn't say you're the epitome of vice, but a little baby just wants to eat and sleep. If you think about it, it's gluttony and sloth, but it's
Right.
Self-preservation. And so you have to teach the virtues as I grow up, because it's not something that's necessarily ingrained in them. So that's getting a little bit off topic. But that brings me to the next point of, having that guidance. And so particularly with prudence and right reason, the idea of the conscience. And the conscience is, I'll use Pieper's words, but it's described as the good must be loved and made reality. Another way, it's your inner voice. If you've seen the cartoon depiction of Pinocchio, it's Jiminy Cricket telling him what to do. Popular media has shown this with the little devil and little angel on the shoulder telling you what to do. And prudence should be characterized by the angel telling you what to do, because it's the right thing to do. So the thing about the conscience, though, is it presupposes this idea that there's something that's right and good and true, and that the conscience should be striving for those. So, Jack, do you want to talk a little bit about that idea of forming a conscience, or what makes a correct decision in the framework of having a conscience?
Yeah, I think that there's obviously we have to have a certain there are certain priors that come into like forming a conscience, right? And conscience isn't something that's, again, like in a vacuum, right? Everybody has access to the principles that help form a right conscience. So like we have to bring into like our background and our education and our understanding to fully exercise right reason. There are certain, and as we discussed in previous episodes, there are certain principles that are inherent to all human beings on the basis of them being human beings. But based upon the culture you grow up in, your society, those things can tell you different things about, again, like what the good is, what truth is, and that sort of thing. And so what we're really aimed at doing here, particularly with this project, and I think in trying to understand Prudence, is that there are particular goods, there are particular truths that are inherent to all men, and we have to develop, we have to have that moral education. I've been reading A Man for All Seasons, and Cardinal Wolsey refers to it, and Thomas More. Thomas More has this particular moral squint, he calls it. And I think we should all be trying to develop this moral squint that will help us to make that correct decision. But we can get into that at a later time. I think at some point we're probably going to have a whole episode about conscience and conscience, the development of your conscience. And there's some great works of literature and stuff that could help us delve into that. Yeah,
definitely. And so going back to the definition, or kind of the different components that Jack mentioned, right application of right reason at the right time. So do you want to talk a little bit more, since we talked about right reason, what right application might look like?
Yeah, certainly. And going back to what Pieper tells us, I think he frames it in a really good way. He likes to break things down to components and makes it easy to understand. So right application is really through things. It's the ability to deliberate, the ability to make a judgment about this deliberation, and the ability to make a decision. Particularly, it's a deliberation of the reality set before you, so the circumstances. So oftentimes we think of prudence in terms of making a decision, which it really is. It's right action at the right time. So you're making a decision to do something or not do something, but it is an action. And so you're deliberating the reality in front of you based upon the principles of your conscience and your reason. You're making a judgment on what the right thing to do is, and then you make that decision and you do it. And so that's what right application is. And again, thinking about it this way, it's not a passive process. Prudence is a very active virtue. And so man acts prudently when, like I said, when he weighs the reality before him, deliberating, applies his practical reason, to that reality, which is judgment, and then makes a decision. And so, yeah, and I think this has some really interesting implications about prudence, which, Alec, would you like to get into those?
Well, yeah, and I just want to make another note about the passivity. You mentioned it's not passive. Mm-hmm. I think with a lot of these virtues, we can see them as an abstract concept that is really like heady, or you say, oh, virtue ethics, and then you think of old men in white robes and togas
sitting around
and talking.
We are.
Well, we're not in the robes yet, and
we're not as gray-haired.
We're not as gray-haired, and I don't think we have the costume budget to get some togas, or maybe the lack of modesty to get into togas either. Which that comes along with temperance. So we'll save that conversation for later. But yeah, the idea that these three concepts are important because they're all working together to have that endpoint of the decision-making process. And so I think we see in leaders, decision is always something that's made. You don't remember a general in war for not choosing. You remember them for making a decision, whether it was good or bad, mm-hmm. Whether it's choosing to charge the enemy lines or choosing to defend the fort or something like that. So yeah, that's just some kind of more tangible ways to think about this, maybe more heady virtue. Mm-hmm. But what about moving on to a little bit more, what is prudence in relation to, a telos? Before we even get to telos, telos is the Greek word for end or goal, realizable goal, I guess we could say. Just quick definition. How is prudence interconnected to that? And well, I guess I should say telos. Maybe we should have talked about it beforehand, but we're bringing it up now.
Oh, well.
Yeah, it's something we'll talk about later.
Yeah. I think, so here's the thing about all the virtues, is that all virtue, but particularly cardinal virtues, are aimed at the good. I mean, that's what we're talking about, is how to live the good life. And that's why the virtues are important. And so they all have, as, I guess, in a way, their end being a good in of themselves, is that they help us become good people, live good lives. And so in that way, all the virtues, and particularly prudence, are ends focused. But I think prudence is really interesting because it also is it's focused on the means as well. It's not just focused on the ends. It surely is focused on the concrete realization of the good, but it's also concerned with the means in the ways in which we realize the good, and that's because it's focused on application, how you get to the end, how you get to the good. And so I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, is again, it goes back to the practicality and purpose of prudence, so that's something that you're constantly working on, something that, like you said earlier about making a decision, it might seem heady, but it's very, very practical, very workable, and very doable.
Yeah, so that kind of brings me to my next point, which is, if we're so concerned about the practicality, making the right decision at the right time, how do we know the right answer if we haven't done it before? So one way I thought about this is, it's not, if you're working on a test and you want to get the right answer, you can study ahead of time, and if it's multiple choice, you have a few decisions to make, and you can memorize the answer if it's a history fact or something like that, and you can say, okay, 1864 is when this obscure event occurred. The way I think of prudence is, it's not so concrete and well-defined. It's more of an essay question, so it's open-ended. It's those open-ended responses where you can write down, many people can write down different answers or different responses and still be right. Mm-hmm. And so even if you're encountering a situation which you can take multiple steps, you're still trying to attain the good or your goal, and you can go about that way 4 or 5 different ways, or maybe 20 or 30, mm-hmm. instead of just one specific way. And of course it may vary. Sometimes you only have one real option to make. So that brings me to the next point, which we talked a little bit about last time, why I'm kind of interested in prudence and talking about it. And that's the idea of, why can't we just run simulations and predict everything, ahead of time? So, Jack, do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I think there's really, I guess, 4 key takeaways we can think of why it's not really a simulation, or why we couldn't just run simulations in our mind, and that's how we would develop prudence. And the first reason is because we can't expect everything to run like a simulation. Life is random. There are very variable factors that occur in life. Obviously you learn from example and that sort of thing. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but things change. There's always a different factor. And so you have to be ready to exercise those, again, that right reason in accordance to everything else that's going on. And so again, in a way, it just isn't an effective way, because simulations are it's not real life. Second, and kind of leading into this, we're in the world, so it's not just our decisions that are affecting circumstances, it's other people's decisions. So when someone else does something, it certainly can affect our lives. It usually affects our lives. I think all action generally that humans take in some way kind of has a ripple effect, whether that's, in your family life, in your social life, all that sorts of stuff. Third, we could sit here and be like philosophers and, lay out a simulated, what would you do in this situation? And you could spend minutes, you could spend days, you could spend months, you could spend years, and you might come up with something good. And then you could think about it for another couple of years and come up with a different way of approaching it. So again, it's sort of impractical in that reality.
Yeah. The way I think of that too is, I took a simulation class in college, and now I do kind of model fitting and whatnot. And it's not that we have to get 100%, but we have to know kind of where we're going, or the kind of general bounds that we're given, especially in the realm of statistics and whatnot. You want to give confidence intervals, usually 5% on each side, or a 95% confidence interval, to say we're 95% sure this is right. And that's usually good enough to make multi-million-dollar decisions or life and death situations if you're on the spacecraft or if you're in a battlefield. And then also just assuming the technology exists to run all these simulations, like Jack mentioned, when are you going to stop? When do you make that decision, that cutoff? So rather than looking at all these possible things that could turn out in, again, minutes or years, the other way I think of it is, as X approaches infinity, or the limit approaches infinity, or something like that, you can get to that point. So it's just, again, Jack said it right. Like, you've got to make the decision. It's your circumstances, your growth in virtue. And that kind of brings me to the last point, is that if you are just running simulations and you're choosing, okay, option 345 is the best option, so we're going to go with that. Well, it's not really virtue, because you're not relying on habits. You're not building kind of a modus operandi for which to make future decisions. And so it's not really growing in virtue. You're just relying on a computer to tell you what to do. And that's antithetical to virtue, which is human flourishment and growth. So,
right. So I was going to say that I think that might be the most important reason why running, computer program to figure out like how to make a virtuous decision would be ridiculous, because you're actually not developing virtue. You're just, there's no habit being formed. Yeah.
And even if you were to have discussions about a decision, which can be helpful, it's not the same as doing it yourself, which gets to the next point, because, okay, we can't rely on simulations, whether it's computer or just running it over in your head over and over again. What can you rely on if you've never encountered a certain situation? Well, if we don't have the experience to know what's right and wrong, well, we can look to somebody who might have that experience. And you don't always necessarily have to have the experience to know something is right or not. I think it is, again, as we've talked about, the kind of natural law, this idea that there are goods and evils, there's right and wrongs kind of inscribed on our heart. We know murder is wrong. We know adultery is wrong. Taking hardcore drugs that are mind-altering is wrong. People are going to disagree with some of the things I said, but, a well-formed conscience will tell you like what these are, what they're right, what's right and what's wrong. So we need to have some experience with good things so we know the association and what we ought to do. So again, if we know getting a good grade is good, then we'll study. But how do you study is a different way depending on the class. So how do we learn prudence if we don't have to begin with?
This goes back to what we were talking about. I think it was last episode. Was it last episode or the episode before that? It had to be two episodes.
Yeah, talking about the good life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that this is not, developing virtue is something you can do on your own, but we highly suggest not doing that, because learning virtue is something that you can do for assuredly with the help of others. And particularly for our target audience here, young men, it's important to have other men who might have different life experiences, who have life experiences that they have gone through that you are now going to go through. Your parents, your friends, they can help, but they can't tell you everything. So in a way, it's like a simulation. But in the end, you have to make the decision. So that's where the habit is forming. I mean, Alec, I'm sure you've experienced this, being, a new father, having a child who's very young. I'm sure you've asked your parent, your father, and your father-in-law a lot of questions about what it's like to raise kids. And so in that way, you're able to develop. You're going to experience similar things to what they did raising you, but it's going to be a little different, and you can take that knowledge and then, your application of right reason and make proper, prudent decisions when it comes to, the health and development and the raising of your child.
Yeah, definitely. It's not a sign of weakness to rely on the wisdom of others. It's a sign of strength, really, because you're giving up, you're recognizing your own, well, I'm going to say weakness. But it takes strength to recognize that, and that you do need help from an external source and can't solely rely on yourself. So now that we've talked a little bit about prudence and kind of how to learn more about prudence, again, not exhaustive by any means. In fact, we might suggest some other podcasts or other resources to listen to about this and the other virtues as we go along. Let's try and disambiguate what some confusions about prudence are.
Yeah, certainly. So the definition we've kind of given regarding right reason and the right application of right reason, these various components can help us to see what prudence is not. I think it shows us that, for one, that something like being indecisive or deliberating too much or deliberating too little, those things are certainly the opposite of prudence. And I think prudence, in a way, it's easy to see. The Greek philosophers described it as the mean between two extremes. I think prudence is it's a fairly easy one to see, where prudent is the mean between two extremes, and here it's between being indecisive or deliberating too much and that sort of thing. So, for example, too little deliberation. When you fail to deliberate, you're not being prudent, because again, it's going back to the components: deliberating, judgment, and decision. If you don't have deliberation, you don't have that right application, and therefore you don't have prudence.
Yeah. On the other hand, if you have too much deliberation, or and then I'll get to the kind of another way to look at it. If you're just thinking too long, maybe the circumstance that you needed to really make a decision about has passed, and that can also be described as indecision. You're just thinking about it, and then you don't do anything in the end, and you kind of take the easy way out, because then events just flow naturally without you having to do anything about it. So again, it's kind of a weakness, or a showing of weakness, because if you can't make the decisions for yourselves and plans moving forward, then what are you going to do when a more important decision comes up, or something that really affects your life? So
absolutely.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about, now that kind of disambiguating what it might mean, the importance with the rest of the virtues as we start to close out. Yeah,
and again, I think Pieper sort of summarizes this understanding about prudence being the first of the four cardinal virtues. He describes it as the mother of all virtues, and he describes it with this Latin phrase. He says that prudence is, he calls prudence the mother of all virtues, and he says this about virtue broadly, that virtue is omnis virtus moralis debet esse prudens, which in English means all virtue is necessarily prudent. And I think that's because all virtue, again, it's all about the right application of right reason. There's this understanding that there's something inner to us that allows us to make decisions, that allows us to apply right reason and make a decision. And I think that's the reason all other virtue comes from prudence, is because, in a way, the decision to grow in other virtues, it is a decision. You have to be prudent. I think that is maybe the most prudent decision you can make, because in a way there are certain, I think the mean between two extremes here is you can decide that you don't want to be virtuous in any regard, or you believe that in some way you can kind of skate by being a good person and think you kind of do the right thing, that kind of sort of thing. And that's very vague, but I think in a way that sort of explains why prudence is the mother of all virtues, and why all virtue is necessarily prudent. Alec, do you have anything else to add about that?
I guess I'll just close out. This has been a very a little harder topic to talk about, because we went in a deep dive on prudence, the first virtue, and it's important to do it right, to get it right the first time, as we move forward in this podcast, and as you guys are listening, because this sets the groundwork moving forward. So I'll just say, again, leaning on Pieper, as we will be for these next virtues, we see that prudence is good, and all the good is tied together through prudence. So he, in fact, said, and I quote, "Whatever is good must have first been prudent." And hopefully you can understand what that means now, seeing the whole act of decision-making. If something's actualized because of a decision, then we can see, that's how it started. And then moving on to kind of a more broader look at prudence, we can see that the prudent life is the good life, especially if we're saying that the good life is attaining the virtues towards a good end, and we say that prudence is the mother of all virtues, well, then everything has to stem forth from that. And so prudence is something that's not just, a weekly basis, a monthly thing that we say, was I prudent this month? Really, you could do it on a minute by minute basis. Was I prudent this past minute? What was I doing with my time, or something like that? And so prudence is really something that needs to be thought about all the time, not to an excessive manner, because that might be imprudent, but really thinking about, how you're prudent and what you're doing. So, Jack, any final things to say?
I think that's it. I just think you all, everyone who's listening, enjoys this opportunity to cultivate prudence that we have in our everyday lives, and treat every day as a day to develop and grow in this central and vital virtue.
All right.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Smith and Scholar. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast on all the major platforms, including YouTube, Apple, and Spotify. Also, follow us on Twitter to stay up to date with everything we are doing and thinking.
Finally, feel free to give us feedback and ask questions across the different platforms. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, this is Smith and Scholar.